Trump is now threatening actions against South Africa. This is what he posted on Truth Social. South Africa is confiscating land and treating certain classes of people very badly. Of course, he means white people. It is a bad situation that the radical left media doesn't want to so much as mention. A massive human rights violation at a minimum is happening for all. That's so insane. It's like they're taking some land for some incredibly wealthy people. And I don't know if it's even been implemented yet. And he's calling it a massive human rights violation. Yet actual human rights violations, either committed by the United States or by allies, right? Saudi Arabia, for example, just go completely unnoticed. The United States won't stand for it. We will act. Also, I will be cutting off all future funding to South Africa until full investigation of the situation has been completed. This is completely unacceptable. Meddling in foreign politics like this, unacceptable. Especially in something that is aimed at improving the living situation for millions and millions of South Africans. And yes, threatening economic action. This is just United States imperialism. This is completely unacceptable. The reasoning behind this, I mean, it's very clear. One, it seems to be motivated by some sort of racism, right? He feels like the whites are under attack by the blacks, and therefore he seems like it's necessary to take action. Because again, there's many countries where real human rights violations are happening, and there is no outrage about them. It could also be because South Africa is one of the countries who are leading the push to get Israel sanctioned for their genocide in Gaza. And this could be just an excuse to retaliate in some form. As far as I know, there is not much funding going from the US to South Africa. I think there's like an HIV/AIDS program. Said that the only funding South Africa received from the US was through the health initiative PEPFAR, which represented 17% of South Africa's HIV/AIDS program. And the total amount was about 440 million in 2023. So that seems to be the amount that could be threatened here. Let's see, it's called What Actually Is the Expropriation Act?
Over the weekend, you would have seen political parties twirling for attention, fighting in the media, criticizing each other, threatening the government of national unity. You would have been hit by a deluge, an absolute tsunami wave of misunderstanding and misinformation about the newly signed Land Expropriation Act that President Ramaphosa signed into law late last week. And so I'm absolutely thrilled to have just one of the best people to speak to right now about what the act actually is not, and what is likely to happen next. She is an award-winning author for her book, My Land Obsession, a memoir. She works in land reform, restitution, and tenure. Please make some noise for the phenomenal Bulelwa Mabasa is here.
All right, let's hear it.
Please just enlighten us of what exactly the Land Expropriation Act is, what it is updating from the old Expropriation Act that existed from, I think, 1975 under the apartheid state, what it actually is and what it is not.
I think the first place to start, Dan, is what is an expropriation? Because I think that word is actually a legal term.
When someone says expropriation, I feel like it just may sound communist to a lot of people. Like, oh, you know, the communists expropriate, I don't know, whatever, your house, your factory, something, and give it to the state. But it is something that is way more than that. It is done by capitalist countries on a regular basis. If you need to build a new road or maybe a new hospital, and there's just a couple houses in the way, the government is going to take those. Of course, they pay whoever lives there a fair amount, and then uses those things. This happens regularly in capitalist countries, even in the United States. This is a normal thing that happens. It's not just randomly taking something and, you know, not giving anything to whoever owned that house. It's just the house is for the state. They're probably going to demolish it and build something there, and they pay fair compensation. That's basically it. Now, she's going to define it legally. She knows way more than I do. Let's listen to her.
It's used so many times and sometimes misused. So an expropriation is really just a state power that is given to all governments, most governments in the world globally, that allows the state to acquire property with compensation if it's needed for a public purpose. Now, a public purpose would be something like a building of a public hospital, a building of a public school.
The Gautrain.
The Gautrain was a good example. And the 1975 Act was used when the people who were living around the Gauteng area were being expropriated.
Okay.
It is also used by government in South Africa, though. So as I said, let me backtrack. So as I said, this is a concept that is used worldwide. It's actually about government administration more than anything. However, because in South Africa we have the unique land reform challenges that we have, we've added something new to the legislation, which is in the public interest. So the public purpose and the public interest aren't necessarily the same thing. The public interest is actually a term that is derived from our constitution and is defined as the nation's commitment to land reform and also to the mineral resources of the state. So there is a huge distinction between expropriation as a concept that just allows government to get land when they need to develop the state, and land reform on the other hand. Land reform is a whole other concept altogether.
I see.
But what this act tries to do is to also provide for the ability of the state to acquire the land, also to make land accessible to those that don't have access to land. So in a nutshell, that's what expropriation is. It's not a new concept, and as you correctly said in your introduction, we've had it since 1975. Why the hula balloon now, and why is there this, I think, in my view, a storm in a teacup?
Performance politics.
Yeah, so apparently the issue arises from that whole new definition about the problem being for public interest. So it's not just, I think it was like public use, so not just about building houses, but now this new act would enable land redistribution. As far as I know, I think about 70% of the land in South Africa is owned by whites, who are, I think, about 7 or almost 8% of the population. So you don't have to be a math expert to realize that, you know, the numbers are not numbering there, right? It doesn't quite fit. So there's a lot of inequality. But one of the issues is that inequality arises from the many years of systemic inequality from the apartheid days. At least my opinion is that if the land was gained by, I think, unjust means is understating. Whatever you think apartheid is, it's 100 times worse than that. So that land, that 70% of land that is in like 8% of the hands, right, which is the white minority, was gained in an unjust way. And at least my opinion is that something like what seems to be proposed here, I don't want to get too ahead of myself because I don't know too much about the act itself just yet, but it looks to me like it is an attempt to right a historical wrong, to give the majority of South Africans an opportunity to have some land of their own, which is incredibly important. So let's see what she continues to say now.
The politics around the government of national unity have a lot to do with what we see at play. I think for a long time, land issues in South Africa have been almost used as political football, which is quite unfortunate because it has actually not helped us to deal with what we actually need to deal with in land reform. What expropriation is not is there is no desire, there is no intention of the state to expropriate any land that is being used, that is being productive. Residential property, commercial property, farmers, mines are not going to be affected. Why? Because you can only expropriate in circumstances where there is no current use of the property.
Yes. And I do want to comment on that because it is extremely common for there to be land for which there is no current use, right? People are basically hoarding land, and that land could be used by someone else. And I think in such a situation, it is very valid to expropriate said land, especially if whoever owns it is not using the land precisely because they own so much.
Yes.
Where the market value of the property is so low that there's more, I would say, liabilities over value over that land. And so forth.
I think a lot of the hoopla has come in expropriation without compensation, what is described as nil compensation.
Yeah.
So can you unpack that for us?
Yeah. What had happened when the democratic government took over, they purchased land, but they used it on a basis of a willing buyer, willing seller.
Correct.
And that was not what the Constitution said. The Constitution made provision for just and equitable compensation. So as you can imagine, the willing buyer, willing seller methodology then led to a lot of land and property being quite expensive, and the state simply not being able to afford
the willing ransom, right?
Yes. There are arguments that say that was pressure that was coming in from the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and so forth, to force the ANC government to adopt this willing buyer, willing seller. It was fear around what investor confidence would be and what the investors wanted at the time. However, when the 1996 Constitution was then promulgated, it made provision for just and equitable compensation, and I'll explain it in a bit. But just and equitable compensation just doesn't take what the valuer says the land is worth.
Correct.
It doesn't take into account just market value. So what it does is it looks at the current use of the property. It looks at whether that property or land was actually purchased for gain. Was it donated? Was it acquired without, was it a donation and so forth? It looks at whether or not there were improvements that were made on the land, whether there was state investment into the land. So it's kind of this methodology. It's quite complex to implement because we've seen, for example, in the land court, judgments that say it's easier to kind of follow market value because it's very difficult then to go into the archives to try and check how the property was initially purchased and so forth. But the bottom line is that just and equitable compensation is also not a scary concept. It just means that when you look at each case based on its own merits, there are instances where the compensation could be less than market value. But what this act does, which is what's going to be interesting because the jury's out on whether or not that would pass constitutional muster. As I said, our constitution is compensation-based by nature, by its very nature. So there are instances where it says expropriation without compensation could take place, and those include things like where the state or organs of state owns land on their balance sheet, but they don't need to hold on to it because they don't need them to exercise their core functions.
Yeah, quite a lot of the examples that have been made have been like the SANDF has a base.
Yes.
They don't use it.
Yes.
It's just lying there. It could be something else.
100%. Some of the land that is also earmarked for expropriation without compensation are, for example, a lot of these inner city buildings where the landowners have abandoned the buildings. They're not traceable. They're not maintaining the buildings. They've become...
honestly, that is something that sounds incredibly reasonable to me. If there is a building that is just abandoned, like the owner is nowhere to be found, why wouldn't you be able to take it and use it for whatever, right? To actually improve the lives of the South African people. It makes a lot of sense. There is something I do want to comment on because we really cannot function as a society if we don't have like basic respect for property rights, right? If we allow for someone to just randomly grab the property of someone else. That's obviously not good. But when you have a system that is unfair, unjust, like the case in South Africa, where again, it's like 70% of the land owned by about 7 to 8% of the population, which is, the white minority. So there is an inequality there. And when you have an unjust or an unfair society, the complete and indiscriminate protection of private property rights is basically a protection and a continuation of the unfairness that exists. That white minority got to that land through violence, both active violence, right, like killing people, and systemic violence, systematically oppressing the black people who live there. So for that reason, I don't think that there should be a complete and absolute protection of property rights. There should be clauses where the property rights of certain people who have too much can be infringed as long as it's causing a good to a vast part of the actual population. So that's my take on that. I mean, it's not about the act. I've said it before. I don't think that this thing Donald Trump is doing is actually because he cares about the expropriation laws of South Africa. Like, let's be real, right? The US doesn't give a fuck about whatever expropriation laws South Africa may have. I believe that this is a way to try to punish South Africa and maybe coerce them into stopping their campaign against Israel at the International Court of, or at the International Criminal Court. Because other than that, I mean, Donald Trump doesn't actually care about this issue. He does not. So it's gotta be something else, and honestly, that's what I think. Do you think that if any country in Africa passes a new expropriation act, do you think Trump is gonna react as harshly as he is now? Because he's gonna be very concerned about, I don't know, like the property rights of the people in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Like, no, he doesn't care. He does not care. He may care maybe because it's white people being quote unquote targeted. Even again, this is an incredibly privileged group of people who, maybe not all of them, but a pretty hefty some of them got to where they are through the apartheid. And yeah, it just feels to me like that is what's going on. Either that, or again, a kind of retaliation for South Africa's actions against Israel.